Moving on to our next speaker, Dr. Areti Galani from the University of Newcastle, who is a lecturer there in Museum and Heritage Studies, and also, unbeknown to other people, has been very kindly been the external examiner to several of Museum Studies HATI courses and always had valuable insight about how to bring the digital but also other aspects of the teaching and improve the quality of the experience. But today she'll talk about her research project, and it's moving on very nicely from Jen's because it's talking about experience-driven evaluation, and also we're seeing until now the art casting experience and how that works with the engagement with the arts. So try to see again, it's different kinds of mobile applications and also in the field, but also without. And what can you do with qualitative data before we move on to talk a little bit more about quantitative. So I'll pass on to Areti to set this up while I bring her slides up.
Right. Hello, good morning. Thank you for the introductions and for the invitation to this workshop. I think it does really follow nicely from Jen's talk, because we're staying with mobile apps, but I'm particularly interested now in the apps themselves and taking more of a kind of a reflective view on evaluation methods of these apps. I think, however, that I need to explain my motivations around this topic, because it's not about a specific project, but it's a series of explorations of evaluation methods around apps in the last few years. And I think my motivation comes from two different places, in fact, that of course we know and we kind of read it in reports, etc., that our experience of heritage, art, culture is progressively mediated by digital applications delivered on mobile platforms. And I think what this means is that effectively those mobile applications, those experiences with heritage are with us pretty much all the time. They are in our mobile devices, they are in our pockets. But also it comes from my own belief and my own understanding through my research and my training, that is that every use of heritage or art apps, and indeed every use of technology, subtly changes or shapes our own sense of heritage and our own sense of art, culture, and so forth. Because our identities, our self is relational. This is kind of the basis of this concept. Of course, that means then for me that evaluating how we experience heritage, art, culture with or through mobile apps is fundamental, or through technology is fundamental in understanding heritage experiences at large. So this is not just about putting the app in a little box and evaluating the app. Is actually thinking about the app in its context. And that poses really a wicked problem. And it is wicked, I call it wicked, because in its own right, within its own characteristics, actually it resists resolution. This wicked problem is, in fact, how do we understand experience of heritage, art, and culture with or through mobile applications? I mean, how do we go about it? And then, of course, the added complexity is that how do we evaluate the felt experience of heritage apps or of art apps? And I think the wickedness of the problem actually is found in the fact of how we define experience. So Wright, McCarthy, and McKeeson in 2004 wrote an article about making sense of experience. And there they say, people do not simply engage in experiences as ready-made. They actively construct them through a process of sense-making. And this process of sense-making is reflexive and recursive. And I think that that's kind of the interesting point here, that these experiences are not a single experience. They're not something that we can evaluate against, take it as granted and finished, but it actually changes, and it changes for the same person in relation to its engagements with other artifacts, other people, etc. Then the authors continue to say that on the basis of their understanding and their theorizing of experience, perhaps when we design about technology is not good enough to just try and design an experience, but actually design for experience. And I think the people who have done, who come from computing science here, they have, or interaction design, they have heard this quite a lot in the last 10 years or so. But then what does this mean for experience? I think it means that it's situated, that is personal and private, especially in the case of mobile applications. It does happen within our person, within our interaction with the application. That doesn't mean that it can be shared, or that it is not shared, or that is not, it doesn't actually activate it within social contexts. But it means that in many ways that our interaction with our device remains personal. But also, thinking about this idea of experiences as constructed, it actually brings us to the issue of this kind of dynamically constructed experience that every time might be slightly different, and therefore it's kind of difficult to predict, and therefore to evaluate in traditional ways. But I want to reflect on those issues by taking you quite out of the museums and galleries and outside buildings. I want to look at two applications that I have been involved in one way or another, and that one of them will take us in Northumberland, in rural Northumberland, out and about. It is an application that, a mobile web app that among others, had as its focal point to actually look at experience, to kind of instigate experience. And among the kind of the context, the kind of the motivations of discoverability of rock art or cup and ring marks, also had the motivation to engender speculation and the sense of place. And the second app that I want to look today will actually take us in outer space. So these are the sort of applications that allow me to think beyond the collection and beyond the experience within the museum context or within a kind of a set building, and think about art, heritage and culture as actually happening in our everyday life. And I want to start with the first one. This was our first attempt to actually think about evaluating apps that were designed for experience. The Rock Art on Mobile project was a project that was funded in 2010, 2011 by the AHRC. It was a project that used participatory design approaches to work with a group of individuals from all walks of life to develop 3 web apps for 3 rural sites in Northumberland to enhance people's experience of rock art or cup and ring marks. And I have here given you a little bit of information about the stats, because I think that that's where we can really contrast to what the stats tell us and what the more qualitative approaches tell us about evaluation. And given that was our first attempt to think about evaluating an app that will provide both information but also would allow people to speculate, allow people to feel and sense the landscape, we kind of used every method we knew about. So we thought that we needed to take people out in the field. We also thought that we need to debrief them, we need to observe them. We used image elicitation in those observations, in those debriefings, and we also used mind mapping. Pretty much any methodology that we could think that would allow us to kind of really get a sense of how people actually experience the app in situ. And of course, when he used such a kind of, I guess, not comprehensive, but eclectic mix of methodologies, you can get some really nuggets of gold. So, for example, we really got people saying how they use the map element of the app in situ. He says, I like the sense of discovery. When you're looking you've got the little map and you actually find the things. And so this idea that the map was really embedded in that kind of exploration of the landscape. And also another participant saying, well, if you know that is there, even if you cannot find it, you know it's there, so you will look for it. And therefore it was kind of, the app was there to let them know that there is something interesting in the landscape. We also, through those observational methods, etc., we got the real kind of detailed information in how people use the app in relation to the landscape, in relation to their own sensory experience and exploration of the specific sites. And so the participant here, it wasn't immediately obvious to me where the ring marks were. You could see one clearly, and that was because of the first picture. You knew what you were looking for. Then it says, but of course, when you look at the map, it's much more obvious where the ring patterns are, and you find quite a lot of them. So actually, the app extended that sort of exploration. It's just something that they couldn't see with their own eyes. And you can also, I guess, get a sense here of the kind of how the app as a physical, as a material object actually fits within the landscape and the user. We also got a real sense through the kind of the group observations how people integrated the material, the content, the actual content within their own discussions. And I really love this quote, because one of the key elements of the app was that it had to have an informal content, because that was an element that came up through our participatory workshop. So that informal content was actually delivered through dialogues, or was delivered through casual language, effectively. And this participant here says, well, I was thinking about it, and then 15 minutes later, I hear the voice in the app telling me this and that. And I thought, there you go. This is what I'm thinking. I'm there. I understand what is going on. And people felt that because the app had this kind of openness around the content, that they could actually speculate beyond the app. So that's one of the ways that we had tried to get people to speculate, by giving them options, but also giving them the opportunity to speculate beyond that. And this participant says, well, I don't think that any of these potential options were right. I actually think that those ring and cup and ring marks are astronomical indicators. And through our mind maps, we got a real sense of how people actually using the app did not necessarily focus on the app. So through the mind maps, people explored the landscape, explored understandings of the past. And in fact, if one thinks that success is when the app doesn't interfere with the experience, then the lack of mention to the app is it can be considered success in this case. However, of course, there were lots of points of dissatisfaction. And that was almost exclusively around content. The informal style of the content challenged the participants, who often mentioned in the interviews that they needed more content, more detailed content, more assertive or authoritative content, but at the same time, they would like this content to be not too long, because they were out in the field, in the cold, in the wind, and also not too authoritative. So it was quite interesting that using the methods of the observation and the debriefing interviews, that people were actually working through their understanding of the app and of the heritage site as they were going through the evaluation process. So they would have different reactions on site, and in the debriefing interviews they would actually re-evaluate those reactions in the context of a bigger narrative around what an app should do. And so that's kind of the evaluation effect. It was quite interesting to actually see that some participants also felt that surely there was more information that the app was letting on. So this idea that perhaps apps should be comprehensive somehow, or this idea that, well, there must be more information if there is an app. So that's the contextual, kind of the situated context of the experience. So in our next project, and that was last year, we thought, okay, we're interested in experience, but we will actually do things a little bit different. We were commissioned, in this case, to evaluate an art project that involved an app that was developed as part of the British Science Festival 2013. And the project itself was commissioned by several bodies in Newcastle, including the Locus Plus, Tyne and Wear Archives and Museums, and Newcastle University Institute for Creative Arts Practice. The project, which was called the Second Moon, it had different aspects. It followed a fragment of the moon around the Earth, traveling with commercial air flight, but also it had an app which would visualize that kind of travel and relate it to one's own position, also the position of the moon, and also educational activities and exhibitions along the route. And the app was really quite simple, and that was the element that we were asked to look at. And again, I include here a little bit of kind of numerical data. In fact, the only numerical data that were ever given in this process that gives you a sense of kind of the scale of this app. Here we thought that perhaps we should actually decide on our methods in a much more focused way. Because this is an app that it follows kind of the idea of the app as an artwork or an art app. And it was really about people experiencing that, that sort of art beyond the project in their everyday life. So the objective was really to capture the user response to the mobile app. However, kind of the different bodies involved in the commissioning had a real interest in us answering the question as to whether digital commissions as part of science projects or museum projects are actually worthwhile. So it's kind of different, as you can see, different kind of motivations in place. In this case, we actually opted for a diary format. It was done in very simple tools using Google Docs, available for people to use on different devices. And the suggestions were very simple for the users. It was just live with the app and tell us how you live with it. That was the kind of the very broad definition of the evaluation. And I want you to get a sense of how people lived with the app, because this is the kind of the lived experience of the art app. So this is Mary, who's the first day of the app, says, at first sight, it feels quite simplistic. But I looked at it several times on the first day, and then I started noticing how far the real moves in just a few hours. I was really disappointed that the second moon seemed to be stuck. But this disappointment then led her to actually Google the location of the second moon and find that it was in Oregon. But also within that first entry says, at first I thought the app would be better if it named the places where second moon has stopped or was traveling over. But then I decided I quite enjoy trying to figure that out for myself. And you can see that kind of the person reflects on their use of app, even within a single entry. Well, says here, well, I've been checking the app, but I didn't do the diary. Why isn't the diary connected through the app? Okay, that's a good question. Why don't we make the evaluation more integral, in a way, more integral to the actual experience? And he says, well, maybe what I say in the diary is not accurate in terms of dates, but my feelings are accurate. So here, kind of how people actually associating the feelings with their experience. Well, on Thursday, 4th of September, then Mary sees that the app shows that the second moon is over China, and that reminds her of her friends and of her time in China. On the same day, Tom actually also sees the moon going, the second moon being over China, but that doesn't remind him of his friends. It actually reminds him, it actually makes him think about the landscape. Says, I've zoomed in so I can see the land, the cities, rivers and lakes. And says it's very relaxing. It's looking out the window of an aeroplane. And in fact, I use the app as a second window next to my main screen. And this specific participant actually sent us a photograph of that. Of course, after 10 days of working with the app, Mary says, well, not long, it has started to repeat itself. I'm looking for some new insight. And a few days later says, well, here I am in Scotland, and that's an insight. The actual user has moved, and the app has moved with them, and that creates a new understanding of the app as they have moved. And when the experience finished, says, well, Mary says, I think the sum up of my experience is one of gaining perspective. And she goes all philosophical. It says, how sad and scary is to think that we are alone in the universe. So it's actually moving into that the bigger kind of aspects of her life. It's like how lonely we might be. But also reflecting on the kind of the actual landscapes as they're seen by the second moon, by the moon, etc., through the app. Tom, however, doesn't actually reflect like this when he finishes his diary. Tom had actually used the app a year ago, like the first time that the app had been introduced and launched with the application, with the overall project. And he had actually thought that he had seen it, so he finished with it. But the diary gave him the opportunity to actually think that, in fact, my conclusion was wrong, that I had finished with that. And the kind of the second moon project is not a product, a result of kind of a finished product, but is an event. And that's how kind of the diary allowed him to reflect on how the app actually changes the nature of the artwork into an event rather than a finished product. As you might imagine, in these kind of diaries, we have noticed the diary effect. So stimulated participants, the diary stimulate the participants to repeat use of the app over 2 to 4 weeks. They also focused or centered their attention to a kind of a special sort of imaginative or self-reflective mood. And I guess allow them to be more to develop a deeper interest rather a peripheral use of the app. However, the diaries allowed us to see the felt experience of the app in action, and that's what we wanted to see, that kind of how the changes around the situation, around the personal use, around the kind of the experience that is constantly constructed actually happens in action. Looking at those two applications and kind of the evaluation methods we use, I thought perhaps I need to say that we learned something. And we learned something in relation to the apps. Not all of it is profound. So clearly heritage and art apps cannot be all things to all people. We're not against usability, definitely not. But good usability does not equal meaningful experiences. But meaningful experiences required good usability. And that was the fact in everything that we have looked. I think perhaps what really makes me more interested in this sort of evaluation and this sort of study is that people make sense and appropriate technology throughout their experience, not at the end of their experience or the beginning of the experience. So scaffolding people's experience with the technology enhances their heritage and art experience. And then so the technology experience and the heritage or art experience are married together. We also found out that mobile apps do not fragment or distract from the heritage or the art experience unless they are designed to do so, or they are badly designed. So I think that this is kind of something that was in the minds of people who were interested in the results of our evaluation. And also that experience of heritage or art apps is made of micro moments. And perhaps you have heard this phrase. It's a catchy phrase within the marketing of apps. But experience of heritage and art with or through apps extends beyond these micro moments. And so it's not enough to evaluate then the moment of engagement. We also reflected on the tensions and opportunities in evaluate the felt experience of apps. And I think that here we'll chime with what Jen was saying. Because what really kind of interests me here is that the evaluation process itself is an extension of the meaning-making process, because it allows participants to recount, to retell their experience. And this is not a weakness of the method. This is actually something that we should harness as professionals or as evaluators. I think that the opportunity here is that we can capture change. And I think the change might be a very small change in terms of how we engage with the app, might be a much bigger change on how we engage with the world, with our heritage. But actually looking through this felt experience, change becomes much more obvious, and this is something that is very valuable. But also that the boundaries between evaluation and studying are blurred. And that means that evaluation is not something that should come at the end of the product or the end of the project. I think what we have found and what we kind of experienced through those evaluations that came at the end of the product cycle or the project cycle is that in fact they didn't quite allow us to go back to the design in a way. They didn't quite allow us to harness the full results. Of course, there are the tensions around this sort of evaluation, and Jen also alluded to them. And I think one of the biggest one is that kind of we have to resist the value reduction approaches to evaluation of art, culture, and heritage. And that means that perhaps there is no value when we cannot quantify it or we cannot translate it into financial or other kind of impact. And felt experience can actually, I think, help us to do that by introducing other kinds of value here. Of course, capturing the sensory and embodied aspect of use requires commitment and requires time, not so much, I guess, technical ability, I would say, but certainly commitment from the point of view of the participants as well as the professionals involved. And also the research and evaluation methods themselves are reflexive, and therefore they are a little bit messy or ambiguous, which means that it's not easy to provide a textbook of felt experience evaluation methods, because every time the specific project will require its own tweaking to do that. And so with that, I would like to say a few thanks for the projects, because they're not the result of my own research, it's the result of research of groups and organizations that funded and supported it. So, and thank you to you for listening to me.
I thought it was very interesting, and did fit in very well with Jen's moving on about the quality of the experience, but also some of the points about the whole cycle of the evaluation. We have time for a few questions. Was there anything anybody wanted to ask? It was interesting to see how you used both of them, and I was wondering if there were any lessons learned that you think you might move from one to the other, if you were to do this again, with the reflexivity and hindsight.
Well, I mean, in hindsight, with the mobile application in rock art, we wouldn't have used all of these methods effectively. In hindsight, I think that one of the real difficulties with actually getting in the mind frame of doing evaluation rather than understanding is that you have to generate data that makes sense to many different people. For example, with the rock art application, although the initial design was for serendipitous encounters with rock art, the evaluation process itself actually framed it as something that people had to do in order to evaluate the app. And that is, I think that kind of the reflexivity, actually thinking about what the experience is about and then finding the method which allow you to capture that is something that we learned the hard way in the first time. And I think that's where the diaries actually worked much better the second time. I mean, one aspect that was really encouraging for us is that diaries were considered to be a very time-consuming process. So it was, people were a little bit worried that people wouldn't do it. But in fact, the people who are interested in those apps and who are the users actually find the time to do it. So I think that there is an element here of trust to your users. Trust your users that they will actually commit to the opportunity to learn more. I mean, in the study of the second moon, we didn't actually frame it as an evaluation at all. Our documentation doesn't mention the word evaluation. We just mention it as a research project in its own right. And people would actually tell us, good luck with your research project, rather than considering that being an evaluation. So there are like lots of little things that were learned in a kind of in a practical way.
I'll just preface this by saying that this isn't a criticism, because I thought that the two case studies were excellent, and your findings were absolutely wonderfully presented and really thoughtful, and they give ground for further work and direction for people who are developing these kind of apps. But actually, in a world of large data sets, your data samples are actually very, very small. Do you think if you had much larger data sets, your conclusions would have been any different, or that you would have felt that they were on a stronger foundation?
Okay, there are different ways of approaching this question, and I know that you don't intend it as a criticism. Evaluation or kind of study work that deals with qualitative data is by definition a much smaller cut-off than big data evaluation. I think that in all yeah, in a textual way, or yes, a textual way, yes. I think for me, answering to the question whether a bigger data set will give different insights, I feel quite confident that within the data set there was enough variety, in a way. So, because, for example, in the diaries, we have the diaries that wrote 122 words, and the diaries that wrote 200 and 500 words. So, and also, I guess within the recruitment process, in many ways, a large data set of the same people who are interested in the same app, it would be unlikely to provide radically different insights to a smaller data set of the same people being interested in the same app. I think what a larger data set would allow us to do, in a way, is actually using different analytical methods, because here we are thinking about the capturing methods, and then we work through a kind of a thematic approach, or we're working through a kind of systems of kind of felt experience approach, kind of narrative methodologies that combine visual and textual kind of input. I think that a much bigger data set would allow us to use kind of, as you said, text mining techniques or bigger visualization techniques. Whether it would allow us to think about felt experience in a more meaningful way, I really doubt it, to be honest. Because felt experience has has its nuances, effectively. Felt experience is not about how many times someone mentions the word, I don't know, I'm happy, but what this phrase actually means in the context of that person, effectively. So yeah, I think different things could happen, but I don't feel that that the results will be different, if you know what I mean. Perhaps the argument around metrics would be much stronger, whether if a much bigger data set was available.
I think that's a wider question for the whole group, the quantitative-qualitative thing that James raised. I think it's a very important one, on whether ideally you want to do both, if you have the luxury to also use and analyze big data in different ways, as well as have the richness of the experience. But unless you have a burning question, we're running a little bit behind, so I think we can keep those comments and thoughts for afterwards. So thank you very much, Areti.